All right, people, let's talk about the hidden risk factors in the whole Africa is booming narrative. Let's get into it. So I wanted to touch on this because many moons ago, when I was studying my MBA, this is a long time ago, almost 13 years ago now, actually more than 13 years ago, it was for an economics class. We did a group presentation around kind of African countries, because it's always been an interest of mine, African countries and their respective performance. And we argued that GDP is a bad measure for growth, right? Because this was 2012. And 2012, I remember Time magazine had like the Africa Rising edition, you know, and it's talking about the growth of the middle income and all those kind of things. 2012, 2013. And they had a point. It wasn't like entirely not true or anything, but there was a lot of nuance. So we were arguing in this study that we did in this presentation that GDP is a bad measure for the real growth of a nation. Why did we argue that? Because if foreign direct investment comes into the country and it's extractive or takes out resources or produces out resources and sends it outside and sells it, or basically the profits are taken offshore, it still contributes to the GDP of the nation, right? So you could be saying 5-10% growth rate, but what's happening is that growth rate is not staying in the country. So we argue gross national product was a better measure for overall prosperity of a nation and its nationals. And it was a very interesting study. From memory, I'll have to dig it up. I might even have it somewhere on a hard drive somewhere. From memory, it was like Algeria was at the top because of the way they had nationalized their resources and those kind of things. Oil especially, that was from memory, but forgive me, it was 13 years ago now. But I say all of that to say that some of the measures to mark the growth of Africa and African society can be skewed. So for example, I was reading a book recently about, it was a study actually, into the growth of Malaysia and Ghana. Malaysia and Ghana, so Singapore, Accra type thing. And the reason why those two are often compared is because we gained independence around the same time, the same year, and actually the income per capita of Malaysian nationals was actually a little bit less than Ghanaian nationals. I think at the time the income per capita was, and this is in the 60s, right? So it was $50 in Ghana, $45 in Malaysia. Now, in the time since, the gross income per capita in Ghana, adjusted for inflation, funnily enough, is actually less than what it was in 1967 or whatever it was. And Malaysia's now is 7 times more. I'll double check the fact in the book, but I pretty much 7 times more than what is of Ghana. So the Africa is booming narrative needs to be contextualized well, right? And well enough to make sure that it's taken into account a variety of factors. Obviously the extractive nature of things here and of foreign investment here mainly, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that Africa is not the future. I believe Africa is the future. I'm a strong believer in that. I think it just means that in accessing that future, you need to understand a lot of nuance on the ground, and that's why we do what we do at Kuro. We've got our proprietary data sets that we use to analyze trends, etc. But we also do field research. We partner with organizations on the ground to extract the nuance, whether it be where to invest next, what's the next hotspot. We combine those two things together: desk, field, synthesis, and partnership, to give you extra insight, right? So Africa definitely has a forward-looking trajectory, but it's on a thin line, right? Population growth alone is not enough. If the population's growing and growing and growing, and there isn't employment opportunities to satisfy that growing population, that could become a national issue, a national threat issue, because, God forbid, an uprising. But I don't think that will happen by any shape or form. But we're a very peaceful country. But you do need to match the opportunity to the supply of talent and those kind of things. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity between kind of the local reality and the motivated capital. Motivated capital from governments, from diasporans. I think that's really important to get to grips with and manage well. So yeah, I think that nuance and that understanding of how things work, that willingness to not compare and contrast to how you experience things outside, is going to be really important for your experience in general. Otherwise it might be quite painful, so that's what I'm observing. Now, the boom narrative has kind of returned in recent years, because I think a lot of people have now come to terms with the fact that aging populations are a factor in the West, with the fact that growth is a factor in the West. All of these manufacturing capabilities that once were in the West had been outsourced to China, and no retrospective backup plan was introduced, is now coming home to roost. So everyone is looking at Africa because of its vast amount of natural resources, etc. But I think the play is still extractive in nature. You can only look at the lithium deal that's being discussed here for an idea of evidence of that, to be honest. But in and amongst all of that, narrative and hope, there is a lot of opportunity, hell of a lot of opportunity, and I think that opportunity can only be realized by those who take the time to explore what's really happening on the ground, take the time to really assimilate to your environment, and then identify the opportunities. All right, guys, that's it for now. What do you think? Is the narrative of Africa's boom overblown, understated, or somewhere in the middle? Let me know.